Hey everybody, Alex here for Nerdy Inc., joined once again by Steve from Review Anything.
Hello.
So today we're talking about villains. We're talking about movie villains, TV villains, all the bad guys that we hate. Or in the case of me, I love the
Sometimes
villains. Yeah,
people love bad guys.
I tend to always be pro bad guy. Every time I take a Harry Potter quiz, I'm sorted into Slytherin. Took a what color lightsaber are you, and I got red, and I'm decidedly pro Lannister.
Hmm.
So I tend to like villains, but that's besides the point.
I like protagonists that are the villains, but we'll get to that later.
I guess we'll just start off talking about what are the new types of villains that we see, and I guess the obvious thing is that now we have villains that need to have good reasons to be villains. It's really not enough to just say someone is evil now because they're just evil. I think very few villains can play that off. You can do that and say, yeah, he's greedy, he's powerful, he just wants to be evil. Like Darth Vader, I don't think would work in a modern movie. They would have to have some
Well,
sort of.
they tried to make them work with the prequels.
Well, that's a whole
This
another can
that's
of
actually
that's.
a beautiful little ecosystem case study right there. Of turning somebody who's just bad for the sake of being bad, all of a sudden it's being a sympathetic character who you don't want to turn bad, but now you know why they're like this.
The moral of the story is that now, if you look at some of our villains who we like, some of the most popular villains of the last maybe 10, 15 years, they're all very well motivated characters, and some of the ones that sort of fell flat are the ones that are just evil because we just needed to have a bad guy.
Hmm.
So we're gonna go jump back and forth between a little Marvel and DC here. I'll start with DC as an example of a good bad guy, and that was Bane in The Dark Knight Rises. I thought his motivations were very clear. You could see where they came from. It just happened to be he took them too far. He didn't like sort of the idea that there could be haves and have-nots. He didn't think that the justice system was fair. In addition to his sort of personal biases, those aside, just he felt that society wasn't functioning in a fair manner, and that was a very good, creation of a villain for a comic book movie.
And then, side note, I don't like how they just threw them all away at the very end, and then it became about some other person who I'm not going to spoil. For
We
some reason, you haven't seen the movie. That's a different problem.
Yeah, we could have a whole other conversation about the ending of The Dark Knight Rises. But looking at a Marvel villain that did not really play too well was Electro in Amazing Spider-Man 2. His character before he became Electro was a engineer of some sort for Oscorp. He was a big fan of Spider-Man. He loved Spider-Man, loved everything about Spider-Man. And then he fell into a pit of eels and got electrocuted and became electric because that's how that works. He was sort of walking through Times Square, and Spider-Man didn't recognize him immediately and didn't remember his name, and that made him mad. That he's anti-Spider-Man now.
Instant bad guy.
Yeah, and the amount of I can't even contextualize in my head why that was a plan that Sony had for that character, because it doesn't make any sense. That it was just ridiculous. And I think an audience has totally picked up on that too. Because if you just go on Reddit and just mention Amazing Spider-Man 2, everyone will talk about how poorly handled, a lot of things were poorly handled in that movie. But the Electro is one of the things that's very high in that list of, that his motivations just didn't make any sense. And it was a weird tactic for them to take with that character.
But that's weird because wasn't the other Spider-Man movies pretty logical when it came to creating a bad guy?
Yeah, you're talking Sam Raimi's trilogy, right?
Yeah, Sam Raimi's, and I'm trying to remember the very forgettable, Amazing Spider-Man one, IMHO, but I can't remember any of the villains. I remember a lizard. That's all I remember.
Lizard was the only real villain. You saw a little bit of just Seeds of Oscorp, but for the most part, Lizard was the only one,
Yeah.
and he was
But
more.
all the Oscorp stuff in this Raimi's versions were all, for the most part, motivationally sound. I thought.
Yeah, you had Green Goblin in the first one who sort of went crazy with the not the venom but the serum, which is not only a I mean, if you just say someone is becoming mentally unhinged, you have decent enough stuff there. But that's how it was in the comics too. Was he just sort of forgot who he was, and he just sort of a dual personality. And then Spider-Man 2 was sort of the same thing, where the bad guy sort of loses himself a little bit, but Doc Ock's motivations were super sound, which is he wanted to come up with a stable energy system, I guess. And he was trying to do an experiment, and the first experiment failed, and it got shut down. And he wanted to sort of try it again because he knew it could work. And he just really all he did was steal the money because that's all he wanted to do was just do it again. All he did was rob the bank. Um, and that just sort
his
of
only crime.
yeah, that's it sort of cascaded out of control there. And then Spider-Man 3, despite all of its flaws, each of those villains had decently good motivations as well. With Harry Osborn being angry at Peter Parker because he killed his father, or so he thought. Sandman not being a true villain, he just wanted to save his daughter. And then Venom, that's actually pretty close to the comics, Venom's origin story, in that Peter Parker made him look like a fool. He lost his job, he got angry at Spider-Man, and that's sort of the Venom made him worse. So that's all three of those movies did a decent job creating these villains. An Amazing Spider-Man series just just is not.
Not to segue into something different, but once you like brought up the Venom example, which sounds kind of similar to the Electro origin story in terms of Peter Parker, it sounds almost like they tried to make those villains a reflection of the main character instead of just a villain. So it was a flaw, like the hero's flaw, and why the hero isn't perfect. But it's just like a stupid thing to point out. Like that's not like what's his name? Thinking Spider-Man killed his father, who's the Green Goblin, Harry Oscorp, or whatever.
Yeah.
Like that's a good motivation. But then just being like, oh, you, I didn't like how you couldn't remember my name. Like that's not like a flaw. That's just a character. That's just a regular human trait that you just exponentially made really bad, I guess.
Right.
Narratively, I don't know.
And that's one of the sort of problems with that sort of a lot of comic movies are having, and it's sort of it's shifting, I'd say, but it's that you need to have an origin story for the bad guy, and since bad guys are usually one-off, very few of them go movie to movie, their origin story has to happen with the hero's origin story,
Yeah.
and so they're always all tied together because you don't have time to just create two different origin stories. So that's sort of why they're always all connected like that. It's just a difficult, that's just how the storytelling has to work.
Makes sense to me.
Shifting gears away from comic book movies, but still into super nerddom. If anyone watches Legend of Korra, that's an example of where you had. I'm only talking seasons one, 2, and 3 because I have not finished 4 yet. It's actually, as of recording this, it's not done yet, so I don't want to talk about 4 until it's finished. So talking about seasons 1, 2, and 3, you had the bad guy's name was Amon in season 1. In season 2, you had, I'm struggling with names here, I should probably look it up, but you had the chief of the water tribe, of the northern water tribe, I'll call him that, but his name's, I want to say it's Unalak, but I'm not positive on that. And then season 3 had Zahir. And I'm also going to throw in Last Airbender, just Firelord Ozai, just so we have an even number. Amon and Zahir had very good motivations. Unalak, if that's his name, and Ozai had no motivations, good motivations. As Unalak and Ozai were just, we want to be powerful, we want to have control, we're greedy, that's the way we are. Whereas Amon in season 1, you had a guy thinking that the world is being run by benders and it's not fair to the normal people of the world, so we should do what we can to sort of equal the playing field. And he just took it too far by saying, well, we should just strip benders of all their powers. And So that was an interesting. You could sort of see where he was coming from, and he's not necessarily wrong because as the show progresses, Korra uses bending to just completely kick his ass. And that's not. There's a lot more that happened in that season. I don't want to completely spoil everything, but it was very clear that they thought out a very good platform for Amon to be standing on. And then Zahir was the villain in season 3, which in my opinion is the best season out of Last Airbender and Legend of Korra. Zahir was a guy who thought that governments, sort of similar to Bane, that governments were evil and oppressive and it's not the natural state of things. And he even throws in, when he's having a conversation with Korra, he says, listen, for 100 years the world was embroiled in a war because one guy ruled an entire nation and just got greedy. And right now the Earth Kingdom is very corrupt, and they're kidnapping airbenders to create their own private army. Governments are naturally oppressive, and that's why we need to sort of level the playing field. Again, decent motivations. He just took it too far by saying, well, for anarchy, it's naturally the way to go. We should just kill all the leaders. So that's why he still falls in the camp of villain, but you could, when he's explaining it to Korra, he makes very good points and has very good views. So having the bad guys with motivations is, I guess, one of my favorite things about our villains nowadays. They all, you can all sit there and be like, yeah, you know what? Not a bad point.
I agree with the villain now. What? Let's flip protagonists and villains. Game of Thrones is kind of also the epitome of that too, because there's really no, like, you have individual characters who are bad, who are just assholes, but that's not indicative of a movement or country or government or larger idealistic force that, shapes the political landscape of Game of Thrones,
That's one of the things I like about that show, is that especially whenever I say I'm pro Lannister, people always say, well, how can you like the Lannisters? And I say, well, because, look at Tyrion. Tyrion's a good guy, right? And they're like, oh, yeah, I like Tyrion. And I go, and look at Jaime. He's kind of sympathetic, right? And people say, oh, yeah, well, he's kind of sympathetic. And so I say, well, that's 2 out of the 4 main Lannisters that you sympathize with. And so then are you really going to... So you're basically saying, well, Tywin is, like, he's a dick. And Cersei is manipulative. So are you saying that an entire noble household and faction is determined by one person's attitude?
Anyways, I'm not going to get too far into Game of Thrones because it's that topic, but in Book 4 especially, like, if you've read the books, you know this, but if you haven't, the books follow, each chapter is a different character, and there's no Cersei up until, Cersei's in it, but there's no chapter from Cersei's perspective until the 4th book. And then it opens, actually get inside her head and you know her motivations and you know why she's doing things. And it doesn't like what she's doing, but it definitely makes it more understandable, I guess, which is an interesting sort of more endgame thing to throw in there. The show does a better job of keeping that more consistent, though, just because of the nature of the show. You can get scenes with her, you get her perspectives, though. Show watchers probably know more, about Cersei than the book readers when it came to understanding why she was doing what she was doing. Sooner. So,
especially early on, I feel like, too, right?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, because at first you're like, what? She's like, books 1 through 3, you're like, she's horrible. She's the worst person ever. In the book 4, you're like, okay, she is the worst person ever, but like, this is why she's the worst person ever. But it's not done in a stupid, like, beat you over the head with it, Anakin Skywalker sort of way, But the show definitely does a better job of easing you into her motivations, I guess, her paranoia.
So do you want to talk about your point then about Beowulf and going back to the history of...
Yeah, this is so it sort of came up earlier, we were talking about Harry Osmond Gorp, about going out for revenge, but you go back to old stories and Beowulf versus Grendel. So Beowulf kills Grendel, and then Grendel's mother comes out for revenge, and then of course Beowulf has to go out and kill Beowulf's mother now for counter revenge. And yes, both Grendel and Grendel's mother are described as monsters, but the fact that Grendel's mother is just given enough motivation that she's not just a monster, unlike Grendel, who just kind of comes in and kills people, and then Beowulf kills Grendel. So it's definitely, going back, people like reasons for people to be bad, even if they're, just one note sort of reasons, revenge or something like that. Like at least it's a reason, and it's something that's logical. So people, I think the heart of this is people like logic in their stories, and they don't like things that just come out of nowhere for the sake of coming out of nowhere, because then it's just like then you're just reaching the point of like angels and demons. Like people are bad, have always been bad for the edge of time, the end of time, and people are good because they're always good, and they're always been good till the end of time. And then you have a recent shift, which is everybody has to have really complicated reasons, protagonists and antagonists, And I think, as we've discovered, it sort of started with making the antagonist sympathetic, and then they've gone down the path of making. You started with good. You started with good versus evil, and then you started having reasons for things being evil. So you added sympathy to the villains, and then you added counter sympathy to the protagonists as we go on, where we have these morally gray characters who you still root for, but they don't do good things, and you still understand why they do the bad things that they do, even if you don't like them, But so like True Detective is a perfect recent example of that, where you have two protagonists who clearly have personal demons that they have to sort out. While they actually True Detective is interesting because what I didn't like about it was there's a lot of things I didn't like about True Detective, probably as much as the things I do like about it. But the villain, the bad entity in True Detective was just sort of bad. Like they just did these ritual bad things because they were ritually bad. So there was absolutely no sympathy at all for any of the bad stuff going on. It was just good people trying to justify bad things in the world. And that fell on very flawed protagonists who were trying to understand themselves as they were trying to understand evil just being evil and just existing, So that's really kind of a microcosm. Yeah, it's just an example of protagonists being way less sympathetic pretty much from the start, but you still root for them anyway, I guess. So True Detective is like the most recent example of that, and it's pitting good people who are flawed trying to justify really bad things. And The Sopranos, I'd say, would be partially the start of flawed protagonists. Actually, they're not flawed. They're bad. They're like most of the characters in The Soprano are like bad. Like they're not people you'd associate with, but they're likable because they're human. Like they don't just do evil things because they're evil. It's like it's business, and this is just the nature of the world that they live in.
And we're showing it from their perspective.
Yeah, completely. So obviously that helps, but that doesn't make the things they're doing right. And it's
Right.
this constant struggle of them trying to be like good humans while also maintaining this bad, job set, I guess. But I mean, when I go to explain, like The Sopranos to somebody who's never watched it, I always just say it's basically Game of Thrones set in North Jersey. Like that's basically what it is. It's the same thing where you have competing huge ideals backed up by people who are completely terrible and people who are a part of the larger associated ideal, which is organized crime, but are really good people and want the best for their fellow man. So you have these, Sopranos is painted in shades of gray, and that's where all the conflict comes from. So.
And that's definitely that. Sopranos laid the groundwork for everything in modern television, essentially, when it comes to
Mhm.
shades of gray, protagonists that are this and that, and
The Wire.
serialized storytelling. Just everything about The Sopranos just was just
Yeah,
yeah.
definitely. And one of the biggest, Mad Men is a good example because Mad Men, the pilot for Mad Men was originally written for not for The Sopranos, but it was written to show them that he knows how to write. Like he submitted it as sort of his application. So you have shades of moral ambiguity in Mad Men, certainly. And you also have it in Breaking Bad, which is probably the easiest example to extrapolate from The Sopranos.
And the show that improved upon The Sopranos model in every
Yeah.
way.
Like Breaking Bad definitely followed like Tony Soprano was always sort of a bad guy, but he's also a family guy. So like that morally gray thing was there from the pilot. But Walter White, his case is a little more, I don't want to say like linear, but you see the evolution clearer, you know.
Well, I always say that The Sopranos is a collection of stories of Tony Soprano
Hmm.
with no definitive beginning or end,
Yes.
and Breaking Bad is the story of Walter White.
Yes. Yeah, that's actually really good. That's a good way to put it.